Okay, the next is item number 8. Members, file item number 8, relating to the BDCP plan documents and various reviews. Mr. Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Late in December or in the new year, we're anticipating that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and its EIR and EIS will begin to be released for public review and comment. Of course, this is the plan to improve delta conveyance and restore substantial areas of habitat that's been under development for quite a few years. It began back in 2006 in the Schwarzenegger administration. And the council it's important to the council for a couple of different reasons. First, once it's approved by the Department of Fish and Game and it meets other statutory criteria, it will become part of the Delta Plan, and it kind of docks into the plan. And we've left the Delta Plan in many ways deliberately sparse so that there's room for it to dock up, essentially. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about here's how many thousands of acres of what kind of habitat should be developed, or we postponed some decisions on the economic sustainability plan that were about issues to mitigate the effects of the BDCP, because we said let's wait and see what the BDCP is like. So as it comes out, we have one of the things we need to be thinking about is, hey, this is going to become part of the Delta Plan. How's this going to work? In addition, the council has statutory responsibilities to consult with the Department of Fish and Game and the Department of Water Resources as they review the BDCP, to be a responsible agency in review of the EIR and the EIS, and then potentially on appeal. If the director of the Department of Fish and Game approves the BDCP as meeting the statutory requirements, both the requirements that are set by the the Natural Communities Conservation Planning Act, that's the kind of the State's Endangered Species Planning Act, and the Environmental Quality Act, that determination can be appealed to the council, and you'll act much as a court of appeals to confirm whether or not the plan actually did meet those statutory requirements. And so it's a big responsibility for you and for us as we try to support you. You'll recall that in August, the Attorney General's office provided a background information on the statutory requirements that underlie the NCCPA and also the Environmental Quality Act. So what we're trying to do now in anticipation of release of those documents is make sure that the consultant team that we've retained to help us with the review of the plan, and then the Independent Science Board, which has also a statutory responsibility to review the draft EIR, that we're focused on the issues that are important to you. And that's why we've brought this memo to you, to make sure that we have a chance to hear your direction, your concerns about, here's what we want you to be doing in this review. We have some ideas, and we've tried to lay them out here. We want to make sure we're listening to y'all as well, so that we write a task order for the consultants, we're focusing them on the right things, so that the charge that's presented at the ISB is focused on the right things. We're trying to use our time and the resources we have efficiently, not necessarily duplicating the work that other agencies will be doing as well. So I wanted to start talking initially about the way we would focus the work of our own staff and the consulting team, and then Dr. Goodwin will talk about the charge that would go to the Independent Science Board. So what we're trying to do with the review of these documents is check to see, is this going to provide the administrative record? This is part of what we're trying to do, is check to see, is this going to provide the administrative record that you'll want should the project be appealed to you, so that then you can see that the key issues have been dealt with, that the director of the Department of Fish and Game had the proper information to make the determinations that are required by law, so you can be comfortable that that was done in a proper way. And then secondly, to make sure if there's specific issues that you're concerned about, that we highlight them now. One of the things that I think is helpful to the Department of Water Resources and others is I tell them it's almost as if you know your project is ultimately going to go to the Court of Appeals, and 3 years before you get there, the judges give you a list of the questions they're going to ask you when it finally arrives. So you can be prepared for it way in advance. And so here's what we'd like to focus on. One is, does the CEQA analysis adequately cover? There's 7 specific things that are laid out in the Delta Reform Act in terms of the range of alternatives that BDCP has to consider, the way in which they're developed. Is it adequately providing that information? Now, the second thing we want to focus on is the mitigation that's being proposed for adverse impacts adequate? Most people think about an environmental impact report, they're focusing on, hey, does it actually tell us what damage is going to be done? And that's kind of a factual matter. But the other thing you're supposed to do in an environmental impact report is describe the measures to mitigate, lessen the damage. And in general, the law says you should be incorporating measures that are adequate, feasible measures that are adequate to avoid or reduce those effects, unless it's infeasible, and then you adopt a statement of overriding considerations. So that's a place where there's going to be a great deal of judgment on the part of the discretion on the part of the Director of the Department of Fish and Game. Is the mitigation adequate for adverse impacts that are identified? And again, you'll recall when the Economic Sustainability Plan was discussed, there were a number of things that the Delta Protection Commission and the counties urged us to do, policies they asked us to enact as part of the Delta Plan that were related to impacts they anticipated from the BDCP. And at the time we said, you know what, we don't have a BDCP in front of us. We don't know what impacts it'll have. It's premature. But once the plan is released, we think it's important to look at the impacts that the project will have, particularly on the Delta as a place, those values that make it such a unique area in terms of its agricultural resources, recreation opportunities, and other attributes such as aesthetics and historic sites that are related to its cultural resources, and on land use in the Delta. And see whether the mitigation measures that it's proposing in that regard are adequate. And then there are 3 things we want to focus the consulting team on in terms of the NCCP, the actual conservation plan that responds to the state's endangered species laws. The first is whether the conservation measures, the restoration and other activities that would accompany the construction of conveyance are going to be adequate to meet the requirements of an NCCP. The law lays out particular requirements that an NCCP has to meet before the Director of Fish and Game can approve it. It has to have reserves that are of adequate size. It has to make sure that those reserves and the other areas that are set aside for those species are connected up to other habitats so that you're meeting all their migratory needs and all their other requirements through their life stages. It's got to have a range of lands that would be protected in the reserves so that you've got areas with adequate topography and the other features that would make for an adequate system. And then there's a requirement that an NCCP has to have adequate financing to carry out the conservation measures. That requirement is not very clearly described in the law. When we look at what's been done in other areas on the terrestrial side of NCCPs, those requirements have usually been fulfilled by in situations where like a real estate developments are having impact on endangered species habitats by either the developers paying a certain fee per acre or per unit of housing built that goes into a fund that carries out the conservation measures, or in some other cases there's an assessment district that's placed over lands that are in the area that's being affected, and that assessment district provides funds for the conservation measures. But in this case, in part because of the way the State Water Project has been financed since it was created, the water contractors are responsible for only the mitigation of the impacts of the project, and the enhancement activities, the Fish and Wildlife enhancement activities, can't be charged to the water contractors. And so there has to be another mechanism to fund those. And one of the questions that the Director of Fish and Game's got to answer, or that you might be asked to answer on appeal, is that an adequate financing plan? You know, are there adequate assurances that the financing is going to be there for restoration? If not, does the plan clearly describe what the consequences of not carrying out the restoration actions would be? One of the questions that I think is important is how the financing plan affects the price and demand for water diverted from the Delta. If we have a portion of the financing that's based on charges per acre foot delivered, for example, charges against the water contractors, and we've got a forecast of how much water is going to be diverted, does that actually anticipate how that demand for water may respond to the increases in prices? Is an issue that's been pointed out to us by our friends at the Public Utilities Commission dealing with regulated utilities. We also want to understand the financing plan in terms of a larger context for which you're uniquely responsible, because completing the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, creating new conveyance and restoring habitat areas isn't the only requirement to have a reliable water supply or to restore the Delta ecosystem. We know additional storage is probably desirable, both to deal with climate change and to have storage downstream of the Delta so we can take more water in wet years and have it stored so we need it in dry years. We know that we're going to need financing for other water management activities to reduce demands on the Delta for integrated regional water plan management. There'll be additional restoration actions that are required in terms of fisheries restoration and waterfowl management. We know that the flood plan has got an expected price tag of $16 billion. So we want to kind of understand, how does the BDCP fit into this bigger package of financial needs as a way to understand, well, how realistic is it that this is likely going to work out? And then we want to look at the governance that's proposed for the NCCP. As part of the NCCP, of the BDCP, as a part of the docking in to the Delta Plan, we want to understand, how does the governance structure for the BDCP dock into the governance for the rest of the Delta Plan? How do they anticipate interacting with the Stewardship Council? How do they anticipate participating with the Implementation Committee? What's the role of the Delta Science Program in coordinating the other science activities that would be part of the BDCP? So those are the areas that we had identified as key focuses for the consultants' work as they review the BDCP. And then we would be bringing their analysis of these issues to you during the BDCP EIR-EIS review period next spring.
Randy?
There is an in addition that you didn't discuss. Discuss that. Last paragraph.
Oh, we've also been in discussions with, it might be better to turn this over to Dr. Goodwin because he's playing more of a key role in this, but we have also been in discussions with them about convening an independent engineering and science panel to kind of kick the tires on the kind of design issues and some of the other issues that are involved in the BDCP.
Actually, is this mic live? Yeah. So we've been in discussions and developed a very initial draft charge for an independent engineering panel to take a look at specifically some of the issues that have been raised, many of them in front of you, on some of the engineering aspects. And so I think that you've fairly well put together. The question is what should the timing of that engineering panel review be? And currently it's Dan, at about 10% completion in terms of the concept of the engineering.
Yeah, engineering about 10% at the time the EIR-EIS is released.
Yeah, and the feeling was that timing may be better done towards 30% of the design when there would be something more substantive to respond to. And at the same time, it's still early enough in the design where any recommendations that came from an external panel could be implemented.
Are you envisioning explicit designs as part of the BDCP that an engineering panel could review?
Peter, maybe you should describe it sort of the 30% level. What would they have?
Yeah, it would still be very much at the conceptual level of the design. So some of the questions that have come up, for example, either we've heard through the Stewardship Council staff, and I think Mr. Grindstaff, when he was there, received several comments. One is related to the cost. Another question is related to the hydraulics. Is it possible to develop these hydraulic transients in the pipeline system in such a way that it could induce seismic activity? These are some of the issues which have been raised to you. So certainly at the 30% stage, there would be reasonable cost estimates to respond to, and there would be the concepts: what do the head structures look like? You have things like vortex entrainment and other things which will go into the inlet structure. You have that being thought through carefully. What does the outlet look like? What would fish screens look like? So that certainly by the 30% design stage, it would be enough there, I think, that you could do a fairly substantive review. But the questions which we were looking at were mainly at these bigger questions. And I think Joe's feeling and our feeling was that many of these big issues could be laid to rest right now. Yes, it was a concern if it was going to be a highly pressurized system. But just getting some adequacy, yes, this is a potential concern, but there's tried and tested engineering methodologies for getting around those issues, and it's well known. So the short answer is yes, a 30% design I think could be very constructive. In fact, I would say that is the most appropriate point for input.
So even though this is included in the narrative that discusses the EIRS review, the in addition means beyond comments on the environmental document, this is something being contemplated by staff as another recommended activity?
Yeah, and really it's only in the last 4 or 5 days that we've understood that in terms of the level of design that this would maybe later this would be better done after the EIRS review period concludes than now. Earlier on, it seemed like this might be more useful during this period, but now it seems like from our conversations with the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation that should we choose to do that, and that's still a question, probably it's up to them, is this going to be helpful or not. It would likely occur later in the review process as opposed to, next spring.
But it's not expressly a part of a normal EIR-EIS process.
Wouldn't typically be, This
I-
is not quite a normal EIR-EIS either in terms of the scale of the project.
Right. Dan, I like the way you started the process, even though this refers to BDCP, it says, and the environmental process, because our three roles raise different questions at different times, and one of the problems, of course, is you're never quite sure, are there things you mentioned in one role that you don't mention in the other, and the appellate role, the decision, the potential appellate decision comes after the plan has been completed and has received various clearance. Although arguably our consulting with DWR and Fish and Game and our responsible agency role might raise similar kinds of issues or questions to what would be raised in the final appellate review, but the broader scope of things we want to raise comes in usually in one of the two early things, consult and then responsible agency. And the appellate role is much more focused on the completed document and the supplemental material related to that completed document, at least I think. Question that rose to me is, are there a set of questions, issues, ideas, requests, whether from us, the science program, or the Independent Science Board, that ought to be raised in the first consulting process, which is during the BDCP development process, which means it goes, I think, as far as I can tell, it goes on forever. Are there things that you'd raise there, very technical things that are worth raising And number two, are there things that need to be raised in the responsible agency role without waiting for completion? And I think what happens over time is we tend to believe that whatever question we want to have should be raised after BDCP is completed. But the reality is we cannot exercise a responsible agency role by punting on whatever we're required to do there and waiting until the final stuff is done. I mean, Mr. Stevens, unless I misunderstand completely.
No, I don't. I think that you characterize a unique situation where we have three specified designated roles that are often dealing with overlapping issues and overlapping timeframes. So you're absolutely right. In our consultative role, you characterized correctly the statute that says the DWR has to consult with us, I think as well as with the ISB, in the formulation of the BDCP itself. And some of these issues could be ripe for raising in a consultative manner. Taking a step back, looking at the history of the comment letters that we've issued to date, again, that's been a bit unorthodox just because we were designated a responsible agency after the project had already started and after the close of the comment period.
And DWR generously agreed to let it
They
to
generously
extend
agreed, and I think
the comment period for us.
Right, and I think that we've now established a good working relationship with the BDCP group to work out some of these issues. So I think you're right. There are a lot of crossover issues, and I think, in Dan's preface to the presentation, what we're trying to do, and I agree with Dan, is we're trying to raise issues that ultimately we as a council may have to weigh in on with some legal effect. And in terms of the timing, the timing of an appeal may happen relatively quickly or simultaneously with the approval of the final EIR and the permitting and the notice of decision. So there may be a convergence at the end. And I think what we're trying to do, our message is, we don't want there to be any surprises for either the council or for BDCP. And what we'd ideally like to see is in all the documents that come out, because they're going to be voluminous, we've already seen scatterings of administrative draft documents come out, that the issues that we think are important that we're ultimately going to have to weigh in on are called out, are distilled by the BDCP people with our advice. So we don't have to go through these documents and search through them and try to figure these things out on our own. So it's more, what we're trying to do is identify the range of issues while being mindful of keeping a focus on what our task is. And again, we're primarily concerned with the BDCP and its potential incorporation into the Delta Plan. But with the overriding mindset that we don't want there to be any surprises. And if there are these crossover issues, we do have a consultative role. And some of these issues may be appropriate in that capacity. And we've heard concerns, rightfully so, that with regard to the focus on the EIR, that some of these issues may not be your typical EIR issues. And that's right to some extent. But again, there are crossover issues. If you look at what the statute charges this council with potentially taking a look at it as an appellate role with regard to the EIR, it cross-references back to the NCCP statute and talks about having to actually have objectives that will meet the NCCP permitting requirements, which includes an assurance of adequate funding and adaptive management program and a monitoring program. So it really ties together. It's unorthodox, but I think what we're trying to do is to address this in a targeted way that really identifies the issues that we're all going to be dealing with potentially at the same time under the crunch. So,
and we've already been at work on our consultative role. Chris mentioned the letters that you've already sent. Our staff has been interacting with the staffs of the Department of Water Resources and Fish and Game and the Bureau throughout this process. So the adaptive management program that they outlined in the administrative drafts of some of the BDCP documents mirrors the one that had been developed for the Delta Science Plan. They've provided input to us about restoration opportunities, for example. So some of the high priority restoration areas you all have identified in the draft Delta Plan are in part derived from some of the early work that was done on the BDCP. So that consultation's been ongoing. Key things I think really are that are ripe and don't need to wait for the EIR necessarily are to begin the discussions of the governance, and we have discussed those briefly with the staff of the department and the Bureau and the Fish and Wildlife agencies, but they've kind of got their heads down trying to get the EIR, EIS done and the basic plan out. And so while they issued some thoughts about preliminary ideas for governance last summer as part of the announcement by the Secretary of Interior and the Governor, they haven't gone beyond that. So we've reviewed those and made some observations about how they would or wouldn't necessarily dock up with what we're doing, but we haven't gone beyond that because partly they've got to be ready to have time to listen to.
I'm not suggesting we need this, but I wonder, is your record keeping sufficient? So if 2 months from now we need to say, well, what's actually happened and when did it happen on our consultative role with the departments, so we could reconstruct the conversations, the letters, the emails, the meetings, whatever it is. The ditto for the responsible agency stuff. I know we've got 3 or 4 letters, one I signed and I think 3 Joe signed on responsible agency stuff, so we could at least track those to remind ourselves what was raised in those documents.
It can be done.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to do it, but it seems to me that one of the ways to understand this, because I bet you we have an item like this at every one of our meetings, all the way through their preliminary draft adoption of BDCP, which is likely to be sometime early next year, I think. And we're going to want to know, what did we raise, when, and then what lingering issues are that you collectively, the staff, including science, wish to raise with the agencies, with the BDCP process or whatever. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out what we would say if giving a report somewhere. Here are the markers we put on the table for issues, possibilities, and factors.
Yeah, and I would think so far my characterization would have been these have been preliminary conversations to identify issues and talk about how we can coordinate, our joint efforts working together with the BDCP agencies to, bring this to the resolution that the Delta Plan calls for, successful completion of the BDCP. I think a lot of the consultation will occur after we've done the reviews of the plan, of the EIR, EIS, after the Science Board has done their work, so that we then have a clearer idea of what, if any, serious issues do we have that need resolution.
I just wanted to add one clarifying point to what Dan had said about, I think we were trying to lay out what potentially Arcadis's role would be and what we were trying to get them to focus on. And I think it's important to emphasize here that just as with the hiring of any consultant, the work product that we bring forward to you would be our work product and not Arcadis's work product. So we're not hiring Arcadis to do, an open-ended review of a draft EIR and then presenting Arcadis's work product to you for your consideration. So I think, it's going to be incumbent upon us, and it'll be a difficult task, but it's as with any consulting role, when you hire somebody to provide technical assistance and advice, that's exactly what it is. So it will be coming from us. So.
But we do want to make sure we're drafting a scope of work for them so that they're focused on the things off the bat that you all feel are going to be important to you.
Does your agreement with this scope of duty for Arcadis, would they also be asked to opine on any consultative issues or issues that should be raised in the consultation with DWR or Fish and Wildlife regarding BDCP. That's our first function. Are they going to recommend or study or opine on responsible agency comments? I'm more clear.
These are a bit of both. I mean,
Yeah,
for example, the governance issue is in large part a consultative role. How is this going to work? You know, how is it? That's not necessarily a CEQA requirement. How are you going to oversee this program? Are the mitigation measures adequate piece is really a CEQA issue. So we're really got both pieces going on at the same time. Again, haven't been involved in the details of the BDCP. We haven't go into all the meetings and all that stuff. So we're looking at this in some ways. This will be our first serious, bite at the apple.
Randy.
I understand the report, and I understand the direction we're headed, and I think that we have a committee appointed to work with Arcadis. It's probably time to start reconvening that committee.
Not being a member of that subcommittee, I am in favor of you two reconvening.
I had a question.
Pat.
Is the World Series over?
Turn them. Mr. Johnston did not turn his microphone on, but he asked whether the World Series was over so that they might have a meeting of the subcommittee.
You will have my undivided attention until the
next
early
World
stages of
Series.
March.
I was going to say this is more likely to be like spring training opening day.
Okay. I've got a couple of requests to speak. Mr. Zlotnick.
Phil, can I ask
Oh, I'm
one
sorry,
question?
great.
And
Sure.
I may be in the wrong.
There's something in here that has for an engineering
Turn your mic on.
Engineering analysis, was that part of the review?
Yeah, we had talked about that earlier too, just a few moments ago, in which the thought was that if the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation thought it would be helpful, we could convene an independent engineering panel to help them review get some independent review of some of the issues that have been raised over the past few months as people have begun to discuss both the cost of the project and some technical issues with the design.
So that's true, since DWR, you said it was not in the scope of work, but
It's not in the scope
if
of
it
work
can
with
be helpful
Arcadis. Yeah,
to
if we
DWR.
did that, we would do it through the independent panel convened by the science program, and it really would be done because DWR and the Bureau would like us to
Would
do
need
it.
it. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.